As many of you know, this place is called Intramuros, also known as Within the Walls by the Spaniards. But would you believe that a few years ago, to be specific, 400 years ago, this place doesn't look like what it is today? It looks something like this. Of course, this is AI, it could be a little different. In fact, I'm suspecting the bamboos are a little taller. A few hundred years ago, this place was known as Old Manila. Old Manila was not yet Intramuros back in the day. However, it was already surrounded by walls. The walls were made out of bamboo and coconut planks. Coconut planks is actually made out of coconut lumber. The western side of Intramuros actually looks out into Manila Bay. It was directly next to the sea. It's hard to know the boundaries back then because no one actually gave a proper map. However, during the construction of Intramuros, the northern part of Intramuros is actually the Pasig River, and the eastern side and the southern side is actually covered with water. The Spaniards made a moat. But let's talk about the history of this place before it turned into Intramuros. So like I said before, this was known as Old Manila. It was ruled by three kings, Raha Matanda or Raha Aki, Lakan Dula, and Raha Sulaiman. The difference between a Lakan and a Raha is that a Raha is a king, while Lakan is actually selected by the local datus. Datus are actually local chieftains, and a Lakan is actually the head. The head is also called Pangulo, just like the president of this day and age. In fact, we still use the same term regarding the president of the Philippines. The Pangulong Marcos, the Pangulong Corazon Aquino, and of course the Pangulong Duterte. Following the Magellan's expedition, Spain sent another excursion to the islands of the Philippines. Of course, back then it's not known as the Philippines. This was led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, along with his two lieutenants, that's Juan de Salcedo and Martin de Goiti. Martin de Goiti was the one responsible in being able to capture Old Manila. Before heading to Manila, the Spaniards actually befriended a lot of locals. Locals that lived somewhere in Visayas. That's actually south of Manila. The Visayans actually aided them in capturing Manila. Raha Matanda is actually quite welcoming towards the Spaniards. However, his nephew Raha Sulaiman was kinda aggressive towards them. There were lots of misunderstanding, and this is where the first battle began. The Spanish actually have superior cannons. Although we have cannons of our own, called the swivel cannons, their cannons is actually designed to break walls. However, our walls were made out of bamboo. It was like a brick being thrown into a glass wall. Our cannons were called the swivel cannons, and the only advantage of it is that you can move it around faster. But it doesn't make sense if the Spanish cannons are mounted on galleons. So the warships could actually just sail away in case they are being targeted. Together with the help of the local Visayan warriors, they were able to capture Manila. Manila was burned to the ground, and Martin de Goiti was the one that took credit for it. However, some scholars believe that it was Raha Sulaiman that actually burned Old Manila for one simple reason. They do not want the Spanish to actually use it properly. Regardless of who burned down Manila, it actually had an effect. The Spaniards have to leave despite conquering Manila. They cannot stay in a barren land that's burned down. They have no shelter, they have no food, they have no water. The Spaniards returned after a year. Miguel de Goiti now returned with Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. There was another battle, and that's called the Battle of Bangkusay, where the chief of Macabebe, somewhere in Pampanga, actually tried to fight off the Spanish. However, the Spanish still won due to their superior firepower and cannons, and not to mention tactics. They were able to lure the other boats into the open and opened fire. Macabebe is a city somewhere located in Pampanga. That's a province. After defeating the local resistance, De Legazpi made a peace pact with the local Rahas. So Raha Matanda made a peace treaty with Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. As for the two other Rahas, actually one is a Raha and one is a Lakan, they still showed some resistance. Eventually, Old Manila became Intramuros, and Miguel Lopez de Legazpi actually ordered that it should be fortified. So from the ashes of Old Manila, it's now turning into Intramuros. Shortly after the capture of Manila, there is another invader, this time from a Chinese pirate. His name is Lin Fei, more commonly known as Limahong. He wants to establish a kingdom in Luzon. Actually, Luzon is actually the name of Luzon way back in the day. He attempted to invade Manila and was able to kill Martin de Goiti, the very same Martin de Goiti that invaded Manila in 1570. However, Martin de Goiti wasn't just killed, he was mutilated. Some parts of his body was kept as war trophies. Limahong was eventually repelled, and he tried to invade Manila again. On his second attempt, Limahong was actually successful in burning down the church of San Agustin. When he was repelled by some Spanish and Filipino forces, he decided to flee, this time in Pangasinan. That's somewhere north. Now, in March 1575, Juan de Salcedo decided to hunt him, and he led an attack to Pangasinan stronghold, leading a 3-month siege while the Spanish took over the fort. Accounts differ whether Limahong was able to escape or was captured. After the attempted invasion of Limahong, the Spaniards decided to fortify Intramuros. So instead of wood, it's now made out of stone, adobe stone. They got stone materials from the nearby provinces in the Philippines. And when it wasn't enough, they tried to get stone from Guadalupe and China. By the way, adobe is actually formed by volcanoes. Now, it's not just fortification of the walls that became a priority. There's now more Spanish military presence in the area. Despite fortifying the area, it wasn't exactly effective when the British invaded the Philippines. The only reason they invaded was because they were at odds with the Spanish forces. It was part of the 7-Year War. The 7-Year War is a war that happened when France actually partnered with Spain, being two Catholic nations. And of course, since France are at odds with the English, they were at war, officially at war. During the British invasion, they took with them some goods. There were a lot of pillaging and looting when it actually happened. However, it's not a complete invasion because they were localized only in Manila and Cavite. They cannot advance forward because they were few. The British also came with sepoys. These are Indian nationals that was along the ranks of the British Army. However, some of them decided to stay here in the Philippines. They also brought some of our cuisine and turned it Filipino, like the curry. It turned into kare-kare. Now, of course, the British left because there was a peace treaty in Paris. It wasn't exactly an invasion that occupied the entire Philippines, but it actually gave birth to multiple rebellions in the Philippines. After seeing the defeat of the Spanish, most Filipinos men decided to try to expel the local Spaniards. The most famous rebellion in the Philippines during that time was actually the KKK rebellion, not to be confused with the KKK of America. Those are two different groups. The KKK in the Philippines are revolutionaries. Their main goal is to free the Philippines from Spanish rule. And their name is actually the acronym of Kataas-taasan, Kagalang-galangan, Katipunan ng Anak ng Bayan. In English, it means the highest, the respected Katipuneros of the sons of this nation. Of course, in Tagalog, it starts with the letter K. It is important to note that the Spanish control is kind of deteriorating. Not to mention the leader of the KKK that goes by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo. He actually made a deal with the Americans somewhere in Singapore. A month later, he was able to procure armaments somewhere in Hong Kong. The Americans will aid during their final attack in Intramuros. This resulted in the Battle of Manila Bay. The fleet of US ships actually met up with the Spanish ships in that area, and not one US life was lost during that battle. The Filipinos, on the other hand, are actually battling the Spanish in the land. The Governor General at that time is actually equivalent to the President, and he goes by the name of Basilio Agustin y Davila. And he attempted to negotiate with Aguinaldo and his men. However, the King of Spain didn't like this, and he was relieved by another Spanish called Fermin Guadenes y Alvarez. Spain doesn't want to surrender to Filipinos. Maybe it's due to something else like racism. Maybe the Filipinos will not be kind towards the captures. But so they actually negotiated with the US. The US staged a mock battle, making the Spanish escape. They constantly pounded the walls of Intramuros, and this prevented the Filipino troops from engaging the enemy. At the same time, the enemy can actually leave anytime they want. After the capture of Intramuros, it was the Americans that was actually occupied. The Americans forbade Filipinos to enter Intramuros, and this led to the start of the Filipino-United States War. That's another story. We just need to focus on Intramuros itself. When the US took over, they beautified Intramuros. The moat that was surrounding Intramuros was removed and simply turned it into a golf course. It turned into a tourist attraction. This was actually beautified by a certain person that goes by the name of Daniel Burnham. Maybe you may not have heard of him, but he's the same guy that beautified a place called Baguio. He was supposed to beautify the entire Manila. Unfortunately, that plan did not materialize because public funding was prioritized in different other areas. And not to mention World War II. Speaking of World War II, that was the time where the Japanese came and took over. Intramuros became the stronghold of the Kempe Tai. That's the military police of the Japanese. They took advantage of the heavily fortified defense of Intramuros, and they also took advantage of the defenses in Fort Santiago. There were lots of human rights violations that happened during that time. However, the worst part of the atrocities actually happened when the war was about to end. It happened when during the time that the Japanese were on their back foot. Even if General Yamashita gave the order to surrender, the others disobeyed, and as a result, to what we call the rape of Manila. The atrocities that happened during that time was not just a massacre, it was a systematic killing. There were survivors by simply pretending to be dead. To make matters worse, the Japanese actually was saving on their ammunition, and in order to preserve their ammunition, they have to do the killings by using the bayonets. They even made a game about it. Women and children were not spared. The American forces, together with Filipino guerrillas, was able to liberate Manila. However, once liberated, horror actually came forth. They saw a lot of human remains. This is an ugly part of history. Inside Fort Santiago, there's 600 remains. And there were also a lot of bodies outside the walls. The good thing is, these are all in the past. After the horrific World War II, Intramuros was actually renovated. It's repaired back to its original form. Old buildings were restored like as if it's the same building that was constructed a few hundred years ago. San Agustin Church was also repaired. So Intramuros is now retaining its former glory. With all the wars that actually happened in this area, there's only one thing I can only wish for. I wish that it will never ever see another battle again. Let Intramuros be the same peaceful tourist spot as it is.